Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that's been in the news a lot lately, and that's loneliness. Specifically, why so many young Singaporeans are feeling lonely even when surrounded by others.
It's certainly a timely topic.
We're basing this deep dive on a CNA Insider article called Young Singaporeans Open Up About Why They Feel Lonely, Yet Struggle to Lean on Others.
Published just recently on October 26.
Exactly right. And one of the things that really struck me in the article was this survey by Talking Point, I believe, that found nearly 60% of young Singaporeans consider themselves lonely. I mean, wow, that's a lot of people.
It is a significant number, and it really highlights the fact that this isn't just about being physically alone. It's more complex than that.
Right. There's got to be more to it.
Loneliness is about feeling disconnected even when you're around other people. It's that gap between the social connections you have and the kind of deep, meaningful connections you crave. And the article makes a distinction between loneliness and social isolation, which I think is important.
Okay, what's the difference?
Social isolation is more about a lack of contact with others. It's objective. But loneliness is that subjective feeling of emptiness, like a void, because your relationships weren't fulfilling you the way you need them to. So you can be surrounded by people at work, school, or even within your own family, but still feel that pang of loneliness. Like your need for connection is just not being met.
So it's almost like, I don't know, being in a crowded room, but still feeling totally alone.
Yes, precisely. And the article features some really compelling stories from young Singaporeans who share their experiences with loneliness. Like Valentina, she's 35.
And she mentioned that she feels most lonely when work gets really tough, and she doesn't have anyone she feels comfortable enough with to talk about her struggles, anyone who really gets it,
Yeah, it highlights that it's not just about the number of connections, but the quality. It's not about having a ton of friends on social media, but having a few people you can really confide in and rely on.
There's another story about Zen, he's only 24, who felt lonely when his friends' lives started going in different directions. He was worried about reaching out, thought they wouldn't have anything in common anymore.
Yeah, it almost seemed like he was expecting rejection before he even gave those friendships a chance to grow and change.
That makes me think how many of us hold back from reaching out to people because we have that same fear.
That's a great question. And it touches on something the article talked about, how societal shifts are impacting this. Like with family structures. Smaller families are becoming more common now, so you might not have as many siblings or cousins or aunts and uncles to form those early bonds with.
I never thought about that. I grew up with a big family, always had someone to talk to.
Right. And then you add in things like the rise of remote work and online learning, which I think the pandemic really accelerated. These changes have disrupted our routines and made it harder to maintain those casual everyday connections.
I see what you mean. Like before, you might run into a coworker at the coffee machine or chat with classmates after a lecture. We've lost a lot of those little interactions that actually make a big difference.
They really do. Plus, there's also that really fast-paced, achievement-oriented culture a lot of young Singaporeans are dealing with. It can be so hard to find the time or energy to nurture relationships when you're constantly juggling work, studies, and other obligations.
Like Dina, who's 27 and trying to balance a full-time job and part-time studies, she barely has a moment to herself. It's understandable why she'd feel lonely.
Her story is a perfect example of how modern life sometimes just works against us getting the connection we need.
But it's not just about being busy, is it? The Talking Point survey identified some really specific reasons why young people are feeling so lonely.
Oh, that's right. There were three main categories. Do you want to talk about those?
Yeah, let's see. There was this theme about having mismatched expectations in friendships, like where one person feels a lot more invested in the friendship than the other person does.
That feeling of not getting back what you're putting in. It can be pretty demoralizing.
Yeah, totally. Then there's the whole feeling of being an outsider, like you don't really belong to any group or community. You're always on the edges, never quite feeling fully accepted.
Yeah, that sense of belonging is so important to us as humans. We need to feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves.
I think what stuck with me the most was how much people talked about the fear of burdening others. Like they don't want to share their problems because they feel like everyone else is dealing with their own stuff.
Oh, absolutely. There's that quote from Sarah. She's 33. She said, "Everyone has to go through life somehow. You can't be sharing your problems everywhere. Your problem is yours to solve."
It's like she feels she has to be totally self-reliant, even when she's really struggling.
Yeah, that independent spirit is great, but it can get in the way of getting support when you need it the most.
Which kind of leads us to the whole other issue of the stigma around loneliness. Like admitting you feel lonely is seen as a weakness, especially in a place like Singapore, with so much focus on success and achievement.
It's true. In the article, Sheena, a 24-year-old, called loneliness a dirty word.
It's like it's taboo to admit you're lonely, like you're supposed to have it all together all the time.
Which is just not realistic. We all go through periods of loneliness. It's part of being human. But when we try to hide those feelings, it just makes us feel worse.
And then we start blaming ourselves. Like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I make friends?
Exactly. Instead of reaching out, a lot of young people turn to social media looking for that quick fix.
Which usually backfires, right? Because you end up feeling even worse.
Exactly. The article even mentioned Ethna, who's 26. She said she'd rather spend hours scrolling through TikTok than admit to anyone she's lonely. And seeing everyone else online looking so happy and connected just makes her feel worse.
It's that whole comparison trap. Everyone's just showing their best selves online, and it makes you feel like you're the only one who's struggling.
It's like a false sense of connection. You're surrounded by people online, but feeling even more disconnected in real life.
So on one hand, you have the internal struggles with self-doubt and this feeling of shame, and then there's also the external pressures of social media and the super fast pace of life. It's kind of a perfect storm for feeling lonely.
It is a lot of factors coming together. And it's not just about the emotional toll either. The article also highlighted some of the health risks that come with chronic loneliness.
Really? Like what?
Well, get this. The World Health Organization calls loneliness a global health threat.
Wow, I had no idea it was considered that serious.
Yeah, and they say it's comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of how it impacts your health.
Whoa, that's a pretty powerful statement. So it's not just something we feel, it actually has physical consequences.
It really does. Loneliness can have a big impact on both our physical and mental health, and that's something we're going to discuss more in part 2 of this deep dive.
Okay, well, we'll definitely have to come back for that.
When we ended part 1, we were talking about the health risks of loneliness.
Yeah, that was pretty surprising to hear that the WHO considers it a global health threat.
It really is, and the article went on to explain some of the science behind why loneliness is so harmful, like how it affects us physically.
Okay, I'm curious to learn more about that.
Well, it turns out our brains are actually hardwired for social connection. It's not just a feel-good thing. It's essential for our survival.
Wait, so you mean feeling lonely is as basic as feeling hungry or thirsty?
Yeah, kind of. You see, way back when our ancestors were roaming around, those who craved social interaction were the ones who were more likely to survive.
Because they could band together.
Exactly. Being part of a group meant safety, sharing resources, and a higher chance of having kids who would also survive. So over time, our brains evolved to reward those social connections.
So like hanging out with your buddies gave you a nice hit of dopamine. Made you feel good, so you wanted to do it more.
Exactly. Those feel-good hormones, like dopamine and oxytocin, became associated with social bonding. And on the flip side, when those connections were missing, our brains would trigger feelings of loneliness.
Like a warning signal. Hey, you need to go find some friends.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was a way to motivate people to connect, to seek out that sense of belonging that was so crucial for survival.
So feeling lonely is kind of like your body telling you something's out of whack.
Hmm.
But what happens when you just ignore that signal? Like, if those feelings of loneliness become chronic,
That's when the real problems start. Because chronic loneliness basically puts your body into a constant state of stress. It's like being stuck in fight or flight mode all the time.
and that can't be good for you long term.
It's not. Think about it. When you're stressed, your body pumps out all these hormones like cortisol. And over time, that constant flood of stress hormones starts to wreak havoc. It weakens your immune system, increases inflammation.
So it's not just an emotional thing, it's actually impacting your body.
Absolutely, it's a full body response. And the research backs this up. Chronic loneliness has been linked to a higher risk of all sorts of health problems. Heart disease, dementia, stroke, even premature death.
Seriously, that's pretty scary.
It is, and it doesn't stop there. It affects your mental health, too. Increases the risk of depression and anxiety.
It's amazing how something we think of as just an emotional state can have such a huge impact on our physical health.
It really shows you how interconnected the mind and body are. And some newer research has even shown that loneliness can actually change your brain.
Like physically change the structure of your brain.
Yeah. For instance, there are studies that show that people who are chronically lonely tend to be a lot more sensitive to what researchers call social threats.
Social threats, what does that mean?
Well, it could be anything from feeling excluded from a conversation to experiencing rejection to just sensing that someone disapproves of you.
I can see how that would be uncomfortable, but it doesn't seem that serious.
For most people, it wouldn't be. But for someone struggling with chronic loneliness, these everyday social situations can feel incredibly threatening.
Oh, I get it. It's like their brains are on high alert, constantly scanning for danger, which probably makes it even harder to relax and connect with people.
Exactly. It becomes a vicious cycle. Socializing starts to feel risky, so they withdraw even more, which only makes them feel more lonely and isolated.
It sounds exhausting to be trapped in that kind of mindset.
Yeah.
But I think the article also talked about how our brains can adapt, right? Like how positive experiences can counteract the negative effects of loneliness.
Yeah, the good news is our brains are incredibly resilient. Just like chronic loneliness can change your brain for the worse, positive social interactions can actually undo some of that damage.
So it's like the more you engage in positive social interactions, the stronger those pathways in your brain become. And eventually, connecting with others starts to feel more natural and less scary.
Exactly. It's like building a muscle. And the great thing is those positive interactions don't have to be huge, elaborate things. Even small acts of kindness can make a difference.
Like just being nice to people.
Yeah. Things like giving someone a genuine compliment or offering to help them with something, those little gestures release those same feel-good hormones we were talking about and help strengthen your social bonds.
It's like a brain workout. So being kind is actually good for you.
It is. And receiving kindness is important too. Knowing that people care about you and are there for you can be really powerful in combating loneliness.
So it's two-way street. Giving and receiving kindness are both important.
They really are. And there's even research that shows that helping others can be even more beneficial for our own well-being than receiving help.
Interesting. So volunteering could be a good way to combat loneliness.
It can be fantastic for that. You're meeting new people, connecting over shared values, and making a positive impact.
So we've learned about the personal stories of loneliness, the societal factors that contribute to it, the stigma, and now the science behind it. It's been quite a journey.
It has, and I think understanding all these different aspects helps us approach the issue of loneliness with more compassion and empathy, both for ourselves and for others.
So what's next? Where do we go from here? It feels like we've really dug deep into the problem.
I think the next step is to shift gears from understanding the problem to actually doing something about it. What are some concrete steps we can take to combat loneliness and build those meaningful connections? And thankfully, the article has some great suggestions for that.
Oh, good. I'm eager to hear about those. Okay, so we've talked about the problem, the whys, the hows, the impacts of loneliness, all that stuff. What can we actually do about it? Where do we go from here?
Well, the article actually offers some really practical advice and even highlights some interesting resources right here in Singapore.
Perfect. Let's dive into that. What's the first step?
It might seem counterintuitive, but the first step is to resist that urge to isolate yourself, even when you're feeling lonely.
Really, isn't that kind of the opposite of what you'd want to do? I think staying home and avoiding people would just make it worse.
It can feel that way, I know. But when you isolate yourself, you're kind of confirming that fear that no one wants to connect with you.
So it's like you're proving yourself right. The more you isolate, the lonelier you feel, and then it gets harder and harder to break out of it.
Exactly. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So instead of giving in to that urge to withdraw, try to challenge yourself to engage with others, even if it's just in small ways. Start with people you already know, like family or friends, maybe colleagues.
So instead of just, vegging out in front of the TV, pick up the phone and call someone.
Exactly. Schedule a coffee date, send a quick text, just check in and see how they're doing. Doesn't have to be anything big. Just those little moments of connection can really add up.
It's about reminding yourself that you're not alone, that there are people out there who care.
Yes, exactly. And if you're looking to meet new people, expand your social circle a bit. Think about your interests. Are there any clubs or groups you could join?
That's a good point. Like if you're into photography, join a photography club. Or if you love cooking, take a cooking class. It's a natural way to meet people who share your passions.
And don't underestimate the power of volunteering. You get to connect with like-minded people and contribute to a cause you care about.
I love that. It's a win-win.
Plus, helping others has been shown to boost your mood and reduce stress, so it's good for your own well-being, too.
It all ties back to that idea that connection is good for us, both mentally and physically. But what about people who feel really overwhelmed by the idea of putting themselves out there, or they just don't even know where to start? Are there resources in Singapore that can help?
Absolutely. Lots of community centers have social programs, and there are online platforms and apps specifically designed to help people connect.
Like You can find groups based on your interests or just people who want to make new friends in general.
Exactly. And if you're struggling with more severe or persistent loneliness, it's always a good idea to reach out to a mental health professional.
Yeah, there's no shame in seeking help. A therapist can give you tools and strategies to cope with those feelings and work towards building those connections.
Exactly. Sometimes we need a little extra support, and that's okay. Taking that step can make a big difference.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. We've really covered a lot of ground, from personal stories to the science behind loneliness, and most importantly, we've explored some real, actionable steps we can take to combat it.
It's been a great discussion. And I think the key takeaway here is that loneliness is a common experience, especially for young people in Singapore. But it's not something we have to just accept or suffer through in silence.
There are things we can do, resources we can tap into, and people we can connect with. We just have to be willing to take that first step.
Absolutely. And remember, even small acts of kindness and connection can make a big difference.
So that's it for today's deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and helpful.
And remember, stay curious, stay connected, and we'll catch you next time.